Thanks, Isley. Well, continuing on the topic of Women's History Month, Margaret Heckler is widely remembered as a political trailblazer, the first woman to earn a triple crown in politics, serving in Congress, an HHS secretary, and ambassador to Ireland. She authored the Equal Credit Act, co-sponsored the Equal Rights Amendment, co-sponsored Title IX. Today, her daughter-in-law is honoring her legacy as a woman of first. That's the title of the book that she wrote. So I spoke to Kimberly Heckler about the new book and what her mother-in-law's story means for women. Take a look.
Well, Kimberly, thanks so much for joining us here today. We know you have an exciting announcement with your new book, A Woman of First. This is the biography about your mother. Tell us why you decided to write this biography.
So Margaret Heckler was my mother-in-law. I married her only son, and 35 years of knowing her, too often I felt that I was in the presence of greatness. With her, during the era of her being in public office from the 60s through the 80s, very few women were even in Congress. When she entered Congress in 1967 as the only woman elected to Congress that year, with 70 men and joining 11 women, it was new for women to be surrounded by men. And so really this was a trailblazer, and the story has not been told. So that's why I wrote the book, because I was overwhelmed with how much she accomplished and how many lives in her 25 years of public service, truly millions of lives that she touched along the way.
Yeah, and you mentioned that, of course, this was a time when women it wasn't common for women to be in Congress, for women to serve in politics. Looking ahead now, do you think she paved a way for many of the women that serve in politics today?
Well, absolutely, and very directly. When she got in there, the women were not chatty. It took a lot for them to get their seats in Congress to begin with. So the women were really queen bees in charge of their own hive. And Margaret Heckler, a moderate Republican from Massachusetts, uh, told the women, "Let's come together. Let's let's if we pull together and cross the aisle easily, uh, we can stand up to the men and explain that there are issues that affect women differently than men. For instance, they were using males and male rats for testing breast cancer before they started this Congresswoman's Caucus, which was the first women's club, if you will, in Congress for women. So it was at that point, 16 women agreed, yes, we will come together under the direction of Margaret Heckler and form this. Today, we have over 150 congresswomen from back in that time period. And so I believe, and she said it was always one of her goals to see more women uh, come to Congress.
And your mother-in-law, you mentioned that she advocated for women in politics, but advocated for women on all levels. How did she do that? Advocate for women just in any career path, not only in politics, but any career path.
Well, two examples are coming to mind. One, when Nixon was president, there were only four Republican women, if you can imagine, 1968. She met with him in the Oval Office with the other three Republican women. He was very partisan, so it was a miracle that those women even got in to see him. But in fact, they brought to the attention that there were very few women in his administration, even in middle management positions. So because of they were called the tiny but mighty group of women. And those four encouraged him to hire Barbara Franklin, who came onto his staff and brought in thousands of women, qualified women that could do the job. Nonetheless, women were now into positions of power, which of course then dribbles into the corporate world. But the biggest example, I would say, is when Margaret in 1980 was at the Republican National Convention, and Ronald Reagan was a nominee for president, and Margaret was fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment. She felt that if we could put men on the moon, we could put women in the Constitution. So she really felt that women deserved economic equality over all things. If a man is doing one job and a woman is in the next office doing another, by golly, they should be paid the same for the same amount of work. So that was her big push and her big battle for women of the time. Ronald Reagan, she met with him in a private meeting in 1980. He had not yet been voted in as president. And she said, "Mr. Reagan, will you support the Equal Rights Amendment?" And he said, "I will not." He said, I will support fair labor laws for women, but not in the form of an amendment. And he said, but now what do? I want the woman's vote. And she said, now you put a woman on the Supreme Court. So because of her urging, and by the end of that 45-minute meeting, she said, Mr. Reagan, will you appoint a woman to the Supreme Court? And he said, I will. So we got justice under the law, maybe not through the Equal Rights Amendment that never got passed, but because she had a plan B, she was able to put a woman on the highest bench in the land and therefore have someone that was looking out for our rights. She had to be a fighter for herself. She would want all women to continue pursuing their dreams, no matter what the level is. And also, after her congressional career, that was just the beginning for her. She came on to become the US Secretary of Health and Human Services, which in 1983 was the third largest budget in the world, and then to be named the first woman ambassador to Ireland. Therefore, she was the only in American history Triple Crown woman in politics, serving as a congresswoman, a presidential cabinet secretary, and an ambassador.
And how can we find this book?
So it is on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. It should be in most bookstores. A Woman of Firsts, Margaret Heckler, Political Trailblazer.
Topic of women's rights today is Equal Pay Day, a marker of how far into 2025 women must work to earn what men did in 2024. Experts say progress toward closing the gender pay gap stalled in recent years, with women earning 83 cents for every dollar men make. Women can advocate for themselves by building a community of people who support and mentor each other, documenting your achievements and knowing your worth. Try asking your professional network about their salaries and using online salary estimators to determine a fair wage.